This is Research Like a Pro, episode 263, The Alford Johnson Project, interview with Michelle Mickelson, part 2. Welcome to Research Like a Pro, a genealogy podcast about taking your research to the next level, hosted by Nicole Dyer and Diana Elder, accredited genealogist professional. Diana and Nicole are the mother-daughter team at FamilyLocket.com and the authors of Research Like a Pro, a genealogist guide. With Robin Worthland, they also co-authored the companion volume, Research Like a Pro with DNA. Join Diana and Nicole as they discuss how to stay organized, make progress in their research, and solve difficult cases. Let's go! Today's episode is sponsored by newspapers.com. Break down genealogy brick walls with a subscription to the largest online newspaper archive. Hello, everybody. Welcome to Research Like a Pro.
Hi, Nicole. How are you doing today?
I'm doing well. I have been recording presentations on PowerPoint today. What about you?
That sounds fun. I have been doing all sorts of things, but I was reading a little bit more this morning in my book on the Ozarks during the Civil War by Brooks Blevins, and it was a discussion about how after their engagement with the Union troops, that after that the Confederacy just resorted to guerrilla warfare. And I've talked a little bit about that before, where they just really made life miserable for all the people living in the area. And so we know we have ancestors that lived through that. And I'm just fascinated with the stories and the things that I'm learning. It's so fun to have a really good historical account. I really want to seek one of these out for all the different areas where our ancestors lived.
Good job reading that. You're learning so much. Let's see. Our announcements today are that next month's Research Like a Pro webinar series, August 15th, is from Ruth Campbell. She's a former peer group leader and member of our Research Like a Pro with DNA study group. And she'll be talking about the lecture, Surprise, My Great-Grandfather Was the Milkman, a DNA case study. So she'll be sharing how she worked on that case and the conclusions she came to, and it should be a fun lecture. So we're looking forward to that. Also, the Research Like a Pro study group is beginning on August 30th and registration ends August 10th. So if you'd like to join us, you have a couple more weeks to sign up. As always, be sure to join our newsletter to get information about upcoming offerings and discounts.
Well, we are excited today to return to the Johnson-Alford project that we have talked about before. We first had James Johnson on, who is a descendant of the people we're going to talk about today. And then we had on Michelle Mickelson to talk about her part as the researcher. And she's back today to tell us more about that. Hi, Michelle.
Hello, Diana. Hello, Nicole.
Well, let me give just a little bit of background to help everybody remember. We recorded episode 257 several weeks before this one, so in case you don't remember exactly, I'll give you a little review. What happened was our clients, the Johnsons, were researching their family, and they came upon kind of a conundrum. Their ancestor, James William Johnson, they eventually found had an identity change. He had been born Patrick Alford and had changed his name to James Johnson because of a run-in with the law in Texas. And DNA proved the case, and the genealogy research proved the case. And so in the very first episode, we talked all about how Michelle created these unique identities based on the records for Patrick Alford and James Johnson. And in this episode, we're going to continue with talking about what happened when she researched all of their fan club friends, associates, and neighbors.
Well, thank you for having me back today. This has been such a fun case, and part 2, I continued to dive into the records of Patrick and James's siblings, and so they all kind of stuck together throughout time. In the Research Like a Pro process, building a timeline is the second step. So adding the events of their family members, their friends, their associates, the people that they live around is what really built the case for James and Patrick. All these seemingly small details began adding up, eventually ruling out the possibility of 2 individuals. So Adding the records from the Alford siblings to the existing fans list established a timeline that agreed with the family story. So I focused on 4 sibling relationships. George Alford was an older brother, and then Becky Alford McFadden, Belle Alford Newton, and Robert Henry Alford. In looking at and researching these 4, all the siblings were accounted for, including Tom, Eveline, Charlie, Ida Mae, and Minnie Alford. In the end, it was so interesting to see that the Alford siblings were fans of both Patrick and James, and you could just see how the family really came together to support their brothers.
How wonderful that making the timeline helped you feel more confident in the conclusion and be able to see the timeline connecting the 2 identities that you were trying to link. That's great.
Yes. Now, Michelle, you previously had talked a little bit about what that timeline looked like. It was in a spreadsheet, correct? And you had put the events at the top of it, and then you would just list all the different people that were in that record. Is that what I'm envisioning here for your timeline?
Yes. So the timeline is set up in a Google Sheets. I just have it on a spreadsheet. And the concept was just to take each record and put all the names of the individuals who are named or listed or signed in that record. And then they're situated chronologically from left to right. So it forms a timeline and you have the names all in one view. So it's really helpful just to kind of see how the names correlate over time within the records, same names, and it just makes it a real easy way to track a lot of records, a lot of people over a long amount of time. It's a pretty big sheet.
Well, I love that technique because this was tricky. The lives, as we're going to see, kind of intertwined between the Alfords and the Johnsons and, the names that they were using at the time. And so I think it helped you to wrap your mind around it, which was really, really an important thing. The next thing that we do with the Research Like a Pro process is do locality research. And I'm so curious, how did you approach this step with this case?
So in locality research, we ask what happened, where it happened, and why it happened. So I asked these questions with each record I analyzed and in every stage of Patrick Alford and James Johnson's life. It's so important that we understand the historical, social, and geographical context of our ancestors' lives. So the ability to answer these questions is what makes our research successful. Beyond personal records, though, it was necessary to investigate the circumstances and environment that caused Patrick to change his name to James. In genealogy standards, number 14, it talks about topical breadth, state, and it says genealogists plan to consult sources naming or affecting their research subjects and their relatives, their neighbors, and associates. Their plans often include artifacts, authored narratives, oral histories, various kinds of records, and other sources concerning agriculture, demographics, DNA, economies, ethnicities, geography, government, history, inheritance, land, laws, migration, military activity, occupations, social customs and norms, religions, or other aspects of research questions under investigation. So there's a lot of things that we can pull from, a lot of information that we can use to learn more about why our ancestors did the things they did. So for this case, I studied surrounding geography, national historical events, and local social context to correlate the fans list timeline. I wanted to know what 1879 Texas looked like through the lens of each Alford sibling.
I love that list that you read from Genealogy Standards. And I think if any of us are asking ourselves if we've done enough research on our people, that reasonably exhaustive research, it would be well worth opening that book up and reading through that list. Wow, so many different things that we could consider. And often I think some of those we don't consider, like some of the government, geography, economics, so many things to think about, to put them in their context and learn more. And sometimes those small things are what make all the difference. So I'm so glad that you pointed that out for us. That's great.
Great. So tell us, what did you learn about the Texas Reconstruction era and the North versus the South and that dynamic?
This is a part of history that you read about, but to actually see it in play was super fascinating. The Alford family moved from Illinois in the northern part of the United States to Arlington, Texas. And this was during the post Civil War era. So at that time, Texas had been readmitted to the Union after their brief attempt to claim independence. And they attracted settlers using land sales to help increase revenue for schools and education. So, amid this post war reconstructions, attitudes continued to simmer, and a lot of deep rooted Texans continued to hold on to that particular dislike for Union veterans. And in the historical accounts that I read, it was a real thing. I mean, it definitely affected the actions and attitudes of that time frame in Texas. One of the things I read from Texas State Historical Association said, and I quote, everyone agreed that lawlessness was rampant in much of the state, but parties could not agree about the cause. Certainly, much of it could be attributed to post war breakup. Bands and brigades roamed along the Red River and the Big Thicket country, which is right where the Alfords had bought and purchased land. Gangs were led by outlaws. They preyed upon the people of northern Texas, and their targets were specifically the Blacks and the Union men, which I thought was really interesting. They would steal their horses. They would, in the name of a militia, they would protect their Texas ideals and things like that. So it was well and alive. And so this was the circumstance that the Alfords found themselves in. They were from the North. They sold horses. They had relatives who had fought for the Union. And these horse thieves were plentiful, and law enforcement was limited. Most disagreements were truly settled with guns. That's just kind of how they worked those first years of Texas becoming a state. So certainly these were unfavorable circumstances that surrounded this family.
Yeah, there were probably many situations similar to what the Alford family experienced. And with the circumstance of lesser law enforcement, I think you're right that a lot of disagreements were settled among civilians on their own without any assistance. And so it kind of sets that stage for what was about to happen with Patrick Alford and his brothers. So very
Absolutely. Mhm.
interesting to set the historical stage there.
Well, let's do a word from our sponsor, newspapers.com. Did your ancestor disappear from vital records? Maybe they moved or got married. Newspapers.com can help you find them and tell their stories. Or have you ever had trouble figuring out how people tie into your family tree? Newspapers are filled with birth notices, marriage announcements, and obituaries. Items like these are a great resource for determining family relationships. On newspapers.com, you can explore more than 800 million newspaper pages from across the US, UK, Canada, and beyond in just seconds. Their easy-to-use search feature lets you filter your results by date, location, a specific paper, and more. When you find something interesting, the newspapers.com clipping tool makes it a snap to share it with family and friends. You can even save it directly to your ancestry tree. For listeners of this podcast, newspapers.com is offering new subscribers 20% off a Publisher Extra subscription, so you can start exploring today. Just use the code FamilyLocket at checkout. Well, Michelle, what research did you do on the siblings of Patrick Alford / James Johnson?
Well, that newspapers.com ad was the perfect segue into this whole case because that played a big part in their circumstance. So George Alford had the most interesting situation of all the siblings. His was a case of mistaken identity. So After learning the historical context that surrounded them in Texas, I researched then the local laws, the court case itself, and more social context. For example, yellow journalism was a big part of sensationalizing local stories and not always fact checking. They just wanted to sell. There were railroads, and those brought red light districts, and these were typical for that time. In the 1880, the rules of engagement were very basic and underdeveloped as far as law enforcement. So there literally was no formal training, as we alluded to before. So all of this played into how the locals perceived what was happening. So research in laws, court records, and articles confirmed the family story that in August 1879, Tom and Patrick Alford got involved in a dispute that resulted in gunfire, the death of their friend, and the eventual death of a wounded officer. Patrick was often mistaken for his older brother, George, who shared a twin-like resemblance. And research found that what happened was on a dirt road between Arlington and Fort Worth, this unappointed deputy marshal had unlawfully apprehended and bound Tom. So, according to 1879 Texas law, Patrick and his friend attempted to defend themselves and Tom within their legal rights. So, Patrick escaped with Tom, who was still bound to a horse. Then he returned to recover his wounded friend. 6 days later, after the officer died from his wounds, those who were there in the gun foray pointed to George Alford as the one who killed the officer, but George was not on the dirt road that day. He wasn't even there. It was Patrick. But George was immediately arrested, jailed, tried, and found guilty of a murder he didn't even commit just because he looked like his brother. And that's when Tom and Patrick went into hiding. His case became a landmark case in the Court of Appeals in the state of Texas, and the Court of Appeals overturned George's conviction, and he was released 1 year later. The court ruled that trying to execute an unlawful arrest warrant was what provoked the shootout, and therefore George Alford was not criminally liable for defending himself or his brother Tom for trying to escape. The Court of Criminal Appeals ordered George Alford released at that time. So even though he wasn't there, he still had to go through the process. And it just ended up being a real sad situation of just a quick decision that changed the course of lives for everybody involved. So under the circumstances of Texas and the mobs and the brigades, them being from the north, these Alford brothers likely had reason to fear those groups, just like the State Historical Association of Texas talked about earlier. So this circumstance supported an identity change and the Arkansas relocation for George and Patrick, who changed their names to Richard Joseph Johnson and James William Johnson. Tom was eventually cleared of any wrongdoing. He was the one bound on the horse. And after many years, Patrick's case was completely dismissed, but names and lives had forever changed.
Wow, so it's interesting that there are so many siblings. We had these three brothers and had to dig into each of their stories and correlate everything, bring it all together, especially correlating it with this unfortunate event and the historical context. So good job getting that all laid out and understanding, because I think as a researcher, that's one of the key things is you have to wrap your mind around it and understand so that you can make more progress in the case. So it sounds like that really helped you.
Right. And how many families do we see where all the siblings just look identical, cookie cutter? And then there are those that are more individual. So this just happened to be one of those families.
Did you discover any other siblings at Texas during this time period?
I did. So Family interviews and cemetery records proved sibling Charlie Parks. So the Alford family arrived in Texas sometime between Ida Mae's birth, that happened in Illinois in 1875, and then Charlie's death in 1877. So he died shortly after they had settled in the Texas area. And like Patrick, Charlie's birth was too late to be recorded in the census household of 1870. So he was never named on there. And then he died before 1880 and was not named in that census. So there's a Texas gravestone that chronicles his short life in between those two censuses. And in the family interviews, it was told that Charlie fell into a snake pit and Patrick jumped in to rescue him, and each of them suffered multiple bites, but Charlie was very young and sadly he did not survive. And from that experience, Patrick earned a lifelong limp for his bravery. There were several descendants who talked about the limp that he had, and that's what it was from. So researching sibling Robert Henry Alford required research and correlation across multiple records for him. Robert was a common name in that family, and the timeline showed that after 1879, the Alford siblings carried on in, an otherwise typical family fashion. They married, they had children, they died, and relationships continued. So life moved on. For example, in 1899, when James married his second wife, Dempsey, the certificate noted Robert Alford as the preacher. And this was the first record that showed a Johnson and an Alford on the same piece of paper. So this indirectly linked the two surnames. But the question was this Robert F., the Alford father, or Robert H., the Alford sibling, or another Robert altogether? So I needed more evidence to prove a connection. Robert still made it on the fan list, but this needed more research done. So according to the information given during Johnson family interviews after 1880, the Alford parents decided to live apart, probably for safety reasons. So Alcee took the 4 younger children, including their son Robert, and she moved back to her hometown in Tennessee. So Robert, the father, remained on the farm in Texas and in proximity of the older children who were married and kind of more established in the area. And they had different names. So I think, like we talked about before, they were under the cover of another surname. Cemetery and marriage records, research in those confirmed each of their stories. So the 2 youngest Alford children died shortly after they'd moved to Tennessee, and this was Minnie Luella and Ida Mae. And then Eveline married in Tennessee in 1884. Then she moved to Washington, where she died a few short years later in 1909 of tuberculosis. Robert F., the Alford father, died in Texas in 1887. And then Robert H., the son, remained in Tennessee, where he married in 1895 and then died there in 1946. So Robert the father's death in 1887 ruled out the Alford father as the preacher. So Robert H. was likely the same Robert Alford noted on James and Dempsey's marriage certificate, but this would involve more research because there was another Robert Alford in the Arkansas area. So it would just take a little more to flesh out, and this was not part of the research objective. So I tabled that in future research.
That's good. Sometimes we want to jump to the conclusion that the person they knew was the preacher, but it's good to not make assumptions and to keep our mind open that it could have been the other Robert Alford who lived in Arkansas.
Yeah.
So, Michelle, in part 1, we talked all about Becky McFadden. So, what did you discover about Becky?
Right. In Part one, we saw hints of a Johnson connection through Becky McFadden, who took James's daughter, Janie, after his first wife, Sarah, had died. And Janie showed up in the 1900 census with Becky. In that census, Becky had a son, Harry, who was 2. And it was Harry's descendants who told the story of how his mother nursed 2 babies at the same time, Harry and another cousin. And I love the picture that's in the blog post. It's just so precious of Becky with her middle daughter and then Harry and Janie sitting together, looking like twins. Becky's oldest daughter, who was married in 1900 and not living in the household, helped her mother with the 2 babies, during the initial movement of getting Janie in the home. So this timeline supports the family story also. And then after Becky died in 1927, Harry took care of his aunt, Sarah Elizabeth Alford, and it was Moore/Murray. She has a couple names. That is a detail that could be fleshed out as well. Sarah also lived in Arlington, close to Becky, until she died in 1928. So they died a year apart. Harry is mentioned in Sarah's obituary as taking care of her. Harry's relationship with his Aunt Sarah and cousin Janie through his mother, Becky, further supports a sibling connection to James Johnson. And all these names, again, were put in the fan list. And it's when you take Sarah's obituary and put the names in there. And that line for Harry was there from the 1900 census. So things really start to come together. So when James William Johnson died in 1934, his obituary named 9 surviving children and 4 siblings. So my clients had previously verified the Johnson children and researched the Alford siblings in depth, including all their spouses and children. So those were all put in the obituary that's there in the blog post. I also noticed in 1934, James's 3 surviving brothers were identified by the Johnson surname. But it was his one surviving sister, Belle Newton, that directly connected him to the Alfords. This evidence validated the story of the Alford siblings' pact to protect their 2 brothers' changed identities. So the story goes that no one was going to mention it. This is our family secret. And the fact that the Alford brothers were noted as Johnsons in the obituary really was a clue that the family was in this altogether. And by then, he had been in Arkansas for well over 20 years, and everybody knew them as Johnsons. So I think it was just easier to keep that secret there. When I compared the siblings in the obituary with the Alford siblings in the census, I noticed the correlation there. And so Robert Johnson of Kingston, Tennessee would have been Robert Alford, and then Belle Newton of Dallas, Texas would have been Susan Isabel Alford. R.J. Johnson of DeQueen, Arkansas, in the same place, would have been the Robert Johnson, but he was George Alford. And then there was a J.W. Johnson that was unidentified. He could have been a cousin, could have been a misprint, but he's one that could be researched later.
It is really interesting in that obituary, 1934, that they just retained that Johnson surname, and how beneficial to have Belle noted there. It's great that it all came together, because some of those were kind of common surnames. Robert, and then initials, RJ, JW. So you want to make sure we're not jumping to conclusions by seeing something like that. So it's great to have that little body of evidence there connecting the family.
It's interesting how the names often are different across record sets. Tell us more about this Belle Newton. Who was she?
Belle Newton of Dallas was named as a surviving sibling in 3 previous Alford obituaries. So to strengthen the Johnson-Alford connection through Belle, I used data from each Alford sibling's obituary to compare in a table. And so with all of this compared, the name of the sibling, the years they died, the location, the surviving siblings named, Belle was in all of them. And so this is good evidence of individual records over time giving the same information. In fact, when my clients interviewed Johnson descendants, they all thought Belle was a Johnson. And when you compare the chronology of the sibling deaths in a table format, it brought clarity as to why they might think that. So I noticed the Texas Alford siblings all died before the Arkansas Johnson siblings. So I looked more closely at location. And Dallas is about 3.5 hours by car from DeQueen, Arkansas. That's just right on the border. And Arlington then is another 30 minutes west between Dallas and Fort Worth. So there's a map in the blog where you can see how that puts Belle's location in Dallas, right in between her siblings. So the Johnson family could easily visit Aunt Belle in Dallas without getting too close to their past in Fort Worth. And they did this often. And in the story, there's fun things about how that was discovered. And so newspapers are an excellent source for family relationships, but the details need to be combined with other sources for verification. And so one of the key documents that directly confirmed several relationships and provided indirect evidence for other sources used in this project was a 1942 delayed birth certificate for James's daughter, Elsie Jane. And this record held the most weight and connected all those dots, that all those questions, everything just came together with this one. The certificate recorded Belle Newton as Elsie Jane's aunt and quoted her as the only living sister to the child's father. So Elsie Jane said that her father was James William Johnson of DeQueen, Arkansas. So that supports the location of the obituary. Then I compared Belle's address at 5410 Mercedes in Dallas, Texas, to the address printed in her obituary, and they both matched exactly. So these details validated the sibling relationship with Belle Newton stated in James' obituary. So 3 key relationships stated in that record indirectly proved that James William Johnson was born Patrick Alford. So Elsie Jane's relationship to James as her father also proved Elsie Jane's relationship to Belle as her aunt, and then Belle's relationship to James as his sibling. So it was logical that if Belle Newton was the only living sister of James William Johnson, and Belle Newton was born in Alford, then James William Johnson was an Alford before he became a Johnson. It just made sense. The fan list and the timeline agreed. There was that lack of evidence as well. So before 1879, James Johnson was not named in any Alford record. And then after 1879, Patrick was not named in any Alford records. So this is where everything really came together. So I think Belle and Becky really did a lot to help this family stay together and to stay protected and to stay safe.
I like how you used a syllogism in that proof argument that you made there with Belle Newton. If she was born in Alford and she was a sister of James William Johnson, then he was also an Alford. It was great.
And I was thinking that often it is the females. They're the ones that keep the records, that keep everybody connected to each other. And I think that really shows with these 2 women, with Becky and with Belle, that they did that, which is neat to see. Well, what was the final result of your fan research?
Well, after all the fans had been gathered, I compared points of similarity between Patrick and James in a table, of course, side by side, and the evidence was convincing. I compared their names. That was an obvious difference, but their birth dates, those correlated. They both had a father named Robert. a mother named Elsie, and the siblings, of course, were all accounted for between these two seemingly individuals, but they were one. And so one of the last things was with the list of bands was the notice of a naming pattern between James Johnson's children and his Alford siblings. It was a common thing to name your children after your siblings, and he followed suit with this. And so his first son is Charles Parker, and that's just like his sibling, Charlie Parks, who he rescued from the snake pit. His first daughter was Ida Pearl, and this is similar to Ida May, who died after the move to Tennessee. And his daughter, Elsie Jane, that was a variation of his mother, Elsie, and Jane after Sarah Jane, his wife. And then his daughter, Lois, with his second wife. Could have been after Minnie Luella, had that similarity between the two. And then he had another daughter, Allie Mae, who was similar to Ida Mae. So all these things just were too many to be coincidence. So it all made sense.
I think naming patterns are so strong, such good evidence. Maybe sometimes we don't think about using that as much as we can, but this case was pretty overwhelming.
Well, and luckily there were so many siblings. That I think was a huge bonus for this family. So
that really helped. All right. Well, it's been so fun to talk through this case and to talk about your research. And next time we're going to talk about the DNA, which of course with the changed identity, we can't forget about using DNA because that kind of puts the final stamp of approval on the documentary research. So
I'm excited about that.
Thanks, Michelle, for being here.
Well, thanks for having me.
Maybe other people don't have an exact same situation, but something similar where you're just trying to identify two different people, and this fan research is just fabulous.
There's no one way fits all. There's definitely an individual element to it, but if you can kind of take something and learn from it and apply it to your own case, that's the goal, is to share something that will spark an idea.
Well, that was fun. Thank you so much, Michelle. And we'll talk to you guys again next week. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Bye-bye.
Thank you for listening. We hope that something you heard today will help you make progress in your research. If you want to learn more, purchase our books, Research Like a Pro and Research Like a Pro with DNA on Amazon.com and other booksellers. You can also register for our online courses or study groups of the same names. Learn more at FamilyLocket.com/services. To share your progress and ask questions, join our private Facebook group by sending us your book receipt or joining our courses. To get updates in your email inbox each Monday, subscribe to our newsletter at FamilyLocket.com/newsletter. Please subscribe, rate, and review our podcast. We read each review and are so thankful for them. We hope you'll start now to research like a pro.